And I'll put this in a larger context. It's very clear that President Trump wants the Nobel Prize. But to get that, one of the things that's very clear is that the Saudis are saying, we will not do normalization unless the war in Gaza is over and Israel is out of Gaza. So if President Trump wants to get the Nobel Prize, he has to end the war in Gaza.
Israel's renewed offensive in Gaza includes, according to Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, the seizure of large areas for security zones. Katz wasn't more specific. We've heard Palestinians describe it as an Israeli land grab. Rafah in the south has been ordered to evacuate. The ceasefire is dead, at least for now. Are we back to square one in finding peace and freeing the last of the hostages?
If you take a look at Steve Witkoff's statement a couple of weeks ago, he said Hamas was playing for time. Steve Witkoff is the American negotiator on this issue, on Russia-Ukraine, on Saudi normalization, on Iran. He is the all-purpose negotiator for President Trump. And he said a couple of weeks ago, in response to Hamas not having reacted, I think, well to a proposal he made, that Hamas was running out of time and there would be consequences for it if it did not respond to the proposal that he made. Now, I want to put this in some perspective. The ceasefire hostage deal that was touted by President Trump, and he took credit for it, and I would say deservedly so, because while Steve Witkoff and he did not negotiate the framework, which had really been worked out at the end of last May, both the Israelis and Hamas did not agree to that framework until right on the eve of the inauguration of President Trump. I think in the Israeli case, it was pretty clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu did not want to say no to Trump, and Trump was saying he wanted this done. And I think that both Qatar and Egypt had gone to Hamas and said, look, if the war stops, it'll be very difficult to resume it, so it's in your interest to do this as well. Trump's coming in. So I think that presence contributed to that framework. But that framework required, starting on day 16 of the first phase, there were three tranches of withdrawals, of releases. That framework said on day 16 of the first phase, the negotiations for phase two were supposed to begin. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu never began those, in no small part because his finance minister, Minister Smotrich, had made it clear if he agreed to phase two, he would bring the government down. Now, simply negotiating on phase two didn't guarantee you were going to reach an agreement. But to remind everybody, phase two was to involve the negotiations for a permanent ceasefire, for an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and for the release of all the living hostages. Phase three was to begin reconstruction in Gaza and the release of the bodies of those hostages who were no longer alive. Now, there was never a readiness on Prime Minister Netanyahu's part to go ahead and negotiate phase two. He didn't do it. He suggested instead an extension of phase one so that hostages would still be released. There would be a ceasefire. Steve Witkoff, when he felt that there was an impasse here, that he couldn't bridge, he offered an alternative. The alternative was release 10 hostages, living hostages, have a 50-day ceasefire. The other half of the hostages could be released at the end of the 50 days. You would use the 50 days to try to negotiate an end to the conflict. So it was not the framework that had been negotiated. It was a variation of it. The Israelis accepted it. Hamas did not accept it. Hamas said, we will stick to the original agreement. Now, Hamas was obviously doing things in terms of how they did releases that looked like they were certainly not living up necessarily to everything the way it had been understood. But that was the Hamas position. Witkoff laid out, okay, you're playing for time. There's going to be consequences. You have an Israeli government now in which they're using force. Their argument, the prime minister says, we're prepared to negotiate. We're negotiating now, but we're going to put pressure on Hamas. And Hamas is saying, we will stick to the original agreement. Now they're putting out that they might be prepared to release five living hostages. There is an effort being made by both Egypt and Qatar. So I don't think that we're necessarily back to square one, but I think there's a basic gap here. And I do think
Yeah.
there's a point at which Steve Witkoff probably has to come in and play a more activist role.
Well, and what do you think that that role might look like? What sort of pressure do you anticipate the Trump administration is willing to apply to get a ceasefire that's operative again?
Having written a book about statecraft, I think in terms of the key elements of it. If your objective is to end the war, what are your means for doing it? What is the leverage that we have? Leverage is key to effective statecraft. We have a lot of leverage on Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's very difficult for him to say no to President Trump. We have a lot of leverage on Egypt. Egypt wants to be in the good graces of President Trump. Egypt has more of an ability than anybody else, including Qatar, to put pressure on Hamas because many of the released prisoners have come to Egypt, and Egypt has basically suggested that if they're not satisfied with Hamas, these Palestinian prisoners who were released as part of the earlier deal, they might put them in jail. So they have leverage on Hamas. We have leverage on Egypt. We have leverage on Israel. And I'll put this in a larger context. It's very clear that President Trump wants the Nobel Prize. But to get that, one of the things that's very clear is that the Saudis are saying, we will not do normalization unless the war in Gaza is over and Israel is out of Gaza. So if President Trump wants to get the Nobel Prize, he has to end the war in Gaza.